All right, First Timothy chapter 6, the last chapter in this book of First Timothy. That's where we made it so far, and that's what we're going to be looking at right now. This chapter has a lot of cool stuff in it, and I think some of it is pretty well known, but I just want to pull out a few ideas and talk about them to help us organize our thoughts and also to tie it into the rest of this letter. The first thing I want to point out is has to do with the way that the Christians in Ephesus, who Timothy is helping out, it's the way that they're being perceived and kind of watched by the rest of the city and by the non-Christians. We've already seen how this was an issue with older men getting drunk and how that was giving a bad reputation, and these women who were being very vain and dressing and being very loud and trying to take control of things, and how that influenced the kind of reputation of Christians. And Paul is very sensitive to this issue of how Christians are being perceived. And he talks about it in the context here in chapter 6 of slaves and masters. And so he says right away in verse 1 that slaves are to honor their masters so that the name of God and the teaching may not be blasphemed. And what that means is that if people in Ephesus, non-Christians, are watching and they see that Christian slaves happen to be especially rebellious or argue a lot or always try to disrupt things, then they're not going to want to become Christians or even be interested in Christianity. But if Christian slaves are the most respectful, the best behaved, and show the greatest honor to their masters, that speaks very well of Christianity and shows other people what it's all about and honors and glorifies God. And just a quick note, we need to remember that slavery, when it's discussed in the Bible, is not the same slavery that we think about in American history. It was, certainly not a wonderful thing, but a lot of people in the Roman Empire were slaves at one point or another, and there was a lot more opportunity to work your way up and to gain status and eventually gain your freedom. So it was very possible for Christian slaves and masters to honor each other and respect each other and demonstrate the love of God in that relationship. This idea of kind of the outward actions of Christians ties back to really right at the beginning of this letter when we were looking that the results of true teaching, godly teaching, should be love that comes from a pure heart and a clear conscience. We remember reading that in chapter 1. And so again, Paul is contrasting different results from teachers. And when he's talking again, this is in chapter 6, starting with verse 3, he's talking again about these false teachers and the types of things that happen after they teach and after their teachings are applied. He says that the things that come from this are envy, dissension, slander, base suspicions, and wrangling among those who are depraved in mind and bereft of the truth, imagining that godliness is a means to gain. So again, we see this contrast. If false teachers are having their way, the things that result is all kinds of arguing and envy and bitterness and wrangling. Whereas if the teaching that Paul wants Timothy to carry on is being taught well and put into practice, the things that people should expect to see, Timothy should expect to see, is love coming from a pure heart, from a pure conscience, and really a radical love that has not been seen before in the relationships of things like slaves to their masters. Okay, so that's really important stuff, and we can see, or you should be able to see, how chapter 6 really ties together lots of the other comparisons or juxtapositions that Paul has been drawing between false and true teachers. Money is clearly an issue in this letter, and so Paul talks about godliness being thought of by these false teachers as a means of gain. And I was thinking about this when I was working through his passage, and I thought I might want to dig in just a bit more here. We think most immediately, of course, this is talking about money, but Paul kind of flips it on its head, and he says there is a certain type of gain in godliness if you're doing it with a humility and with contentment. And so I'm wondering just how other types of gain we might associate with godliness or with our Christian faith. I certainly have thought at times, it makes me more healthy in certain ways. My relationships are healthier and better. My perspective on life, I feel like, is a bit more kind of humble and maybe down to earth. There's happiness that comes from it and satisfaction, joy and peace and these types of things. But I think that we have to remember the point of godliness is never gain for ourselves. The point of godliness is to glorify God so that his will can be done on earth, and so that everybody, right relationships, everybody will benefit, and we can all ultimately experience God's goodness more and more. So just something to maybe reflect on yourself. Now, a famous verse is verse 10 in chapter 6, where it talks about the love of money as a root of evil. Some translations have said that the love of money is the root of all evil. I think most good translations now have done away with that and correctly translate it, saying the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. So of course we know that you can get into trouble and do evil things without loving money. But loving money is a really serious one. And Paul talks about these interesting words. I think we can kind of think about gain and pain. For many of us, we've been taught, or we know from society even, that if you're obsessed with money, great things are not going to happen to you. But we, maybe as Christians, sometimes think that that's wrong because it's misplacing priorities or something like that. And I really like how Paul says in verse 10 there at the end, those who have wanted to be rich have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pains. And so we see that Paul has discerned, and is pretty perceptive of him, that it's not just something that God doesn't want you to do, or something that is going to cause jealousy if other people know that you're rich. Actually, pursuing wealth as an ultimate goal causes you to experience lots of pains. And do you remember earlier when it talked about false teachers whose consciences had been pierced with or seared with a hot iron? Kind of a similar image here. People piercing themselves because of their desire to get rich. And so we can carry on with this theme of money. It continues in verse 6, and this is obviously, like I said earlier, a theme in this book. The false teachers are desiring money themselves. Some of the younger widows had been buying expensive clothes, and they seemed to be caught up with money, maybe misusing the money that the church had been giving them to support them. And it seems that some of these false teachers are convincing the followers, some of the Christians, that they should also be interested in money or trying to get rich. And I love the way that Paul contrasts material wealth with being wealthy in God's eyes, or as he says in verse 18, being rich in good works. And I love the way that he contrasts those two things. Storing up for themselves a treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they can take hold of the life that is really life. And I think for our culture in America, which has been very materialistic for quite a while now, many people are realizing that your wealth cannot protect you in life's tragedies. And Paul talks about that too. He talks about the uncertainty of riches, right, in verse 17. But those who have experienced the life that Christ offers, the life of love that comes from a pure heart, know that that is real life, and it makes the life of wealth and pursuing riches pale in comparison. So I think that's a really neat thing to think about. Paul talking about the life that is really life and being rich in good works, being rich in godliness, not thinking about our material wealth or even our experiences really, but our relationships and the people that we know who are part of God's family and the people who we are loving and trying to welcome into God's family. And of course, it reminds us of what Paul says earlier in the book, that women should not be adorning themselves with clothes and fancy accessories and jewelry, but they should be adorning themselves with good works. So these are some of the main points I wanted to pull out in the passage. We wrap this up, and we've really seen the contrast between false teaching and true teaching, and godliness versus worldliness. And I think this is a really cool picture of kind of the intimate relationship between Paul and Timothy and what he's praying for and hoping for in that community. So that's all for now. And I look forward to talking about these things more with you.